I guess I should introduce myself, perhaps. My name is Kelly Cope. I am the USU Extension Turfgrass Specialist, and I also have a lot of work in the landscape water conservation area. So I won't be addressing that so much today, but it's certainly within my area of expertise, and so something that you could communicate with me about in the future. Today, though, I'm going to be emphasizing some turfgrass information, and I know I just caught a little bit of Dennis's presentation, and I know he addressed a little bit about turf, which is great. My emphasis with this presentation is twofold. First, to give you some helpful tips for identifying turf grasses, because that can be a big indicator of what pest you might be dealing with. So I'm going to give you some characteristics to look for so you can identify the commonly grown turf grasses in the state. And then I'm also going to walk you through sort of a detective method for determining what problem you might be dealing with or you might be getting asked about, because you're all new nursery employees, correct? Maybe I should ask you who you are before I start talking. Who are you people? What do you do? What do you do?
City government.
Oh, I'm with the government? Love that. Okay. What else?
Nursery, but we have some veteran employees.
Oh, got it. Okay. Okay. So thank you for that. That's helpful. So for those of you who are more on the veteran side, I suspect some of this will be a little bit of a review. Those of you who are new employees, hopefully it'll be helpful to you as you get started. I know, because I also work with members of the public, I get direct phone calls and direct visits, that oftentimes what I'm doing is, like I said, sort of detective work, asking a lot of questions and trying to figure out what the problem is. So I start out, generally speaking, by trying to gather a lot of basic information from whoever it is that's approaching me. And part of that involves knowing the history of the area, and that's where you and I would be totally clueless. I mean, I don't know how somebody's been managing their lawn. They may have even just moved into an area and not know much about what's happened historically. So part of what I do is gather as much information as I can about the history of the area and how it was managed, then knowing the species, and that's what I'm going to help you with here this morning. Once a problem is determined, once it's determined that there is some kind of problem, helping them to identify exactly what it is quickly, because with most pest situations, the quicker you deal with it, the easier it's going to be to get some control and alleviate the situation. So that involves encouraging folks to check for symptoms early, or at least notice, notice what's happening in their lawn, in this case, earlier than later. That's helpful. If it's determined that they need to do some sampling of the area, we talk about appropriate practices there. I give them a couple of simple things that they can do at home that might be helpful. And then I also talk with them a lot about resources. And I think one of the great things that's happening for you here today is that you are becoming familiar with folks who are around to help you. Mike was just here, Dennis was here earlier. We're all charged with helping folks like you do your jobs. So let's begin with the history part of things. When I start asking folks these questions, I look at whether or not they had past problems, because that can sometimes be an indicator of what's going on now. And then, ideally, they would have had some kind of records. Now, I know for individual homeowners, this isn't necessarily a realistic expectation, but if you're talking with somebody who has been doing this for a while, maybe a contractor of some kind, they may have these kind of records. And so, if it's somebody like that, getting a handle on their irrigation practices, what they've been doing in terms of fertilization, whether or not they've done any past pest treatment, mowing practices, how the area was established, that's especially important if you're talking to somebody who's got a property with a newer landscape. How exactly was that landscape developed and established? What are their aeration practices? So with this, just getting an idea of what they've been doing. Again, getting some idea of the history of the property. Now, understanding what's out there, again, I'm going to talk with you about identifying certain turf species, because many of the pests that we see in the state affect only certain turf species. So if you can start there by identifying the turf species, then that can be helpful for determining exactly what the problems are. Now, most lawns, having said that, most lawns are a mixture or a blend. So a mixture of species, for example, you might have Kentucky bluegrass mixed with tall fescue mixed with perennial ryegrass, Or you might have a blend of varieties of one species. So for example, perhaps a Kentucky bluegrass lawn that's got 5 different varieties. So it's very common. You're going to either have a mixture or a blend. But again, being able to identify what species are out there is going to be helpful. And then you might determine that damage may only show up on one species, and that can also be helpful in determining what's going on. Now what you see here, we're going to do some basic turfgrass anatomy. This is a stylized, I guess I would say, turfgrass plant, and I'm going to focus on a couple of different plant parts as far as identifying turfgrasses, but in general, you can't, depending on what they bring you, mind you, I guess it's all qualified by that. They may bring you simply some top growth. They may bring you a plug that includes some soil. They may bring you something much more significant than that. But being familiar with whether the species you're working with has rhizomes, so below ground stems, stolons, above ground stems, or is perhaps a tillering species that develops by increasing the number of tillers in this way, that can help you to identify the species. But 2 things that I'm really going to focus on, because I suspect more often than not, they're going to bring you just this top part of the plant. And that might be all you have to work with or look at. And so I'm going to really focus on these 2 parts, the auricle of the turfgrass plant and the ligule, or the lack thereof, and I'll show you what I mean by that. But those 2 simple plant parts can really help you identify the species that you're dealing with. So let me just back up for a second. So the auricle and the ligule, these are both plant parts that you will find at this point where the leaf meets the stem. Okay, so that's the area I'm focusing on. Now the auricle, here you can see the base of a leaf, and an auricle can look a few different ways commonly. So this is what I'm talking about right here, this plant part right here. So this would be the part that is enclosing the stem of the turfgrass plant. In this case, on the left, what you see are claw-like auricles. They almost look like they're hugging the stem of the turfgrass plant. Here you have something a little bit less than that. Those are considered rounded auricles. So they're not touching one another, but they are clasping the stem a little bit. Here it's a little bit less. So they exist, but they're not fully developed. And finally here on this image, the auricles are entirely absent. So if you can have a look at that point where the leaf meets the stem and determine what sort of auricles it has, it can help you to start to identify the plant. Now the ligule is this part of the leaf, and it's exactly at the base of the leaf where it meets the stem, and it can be anything from here where it's membranous and really obvious looking, typically a whitish color. It can be a fringe of hairs like you see in this image. It can be shorter. It can be completely absent. It can be extremely prominent. It can be tapered as you see here, or it might even be scalloped. Okay? So those 2 things, the way the auricles look and the way the ligules look, along with a few other characteristics, can help you identify species. So we'll start with Kentucky bluegrass because this is the one you're going to see most often. Color is going to be dark green, medium textured grass. New leaves are folded in the bud, and I'll show you what that means in a minute. And it doesn't have any auricles. Okay? So there's no plant part clasping around the stem in this case. It does, on the other hand, have a short membranous ligule, and I'll show you this in a minute, and a boat-shaped leaf tip along with parallel leaves. So what am I talking about here? Here is the short membranous ligule. So it might look something like that. And then if you were to grasp, just look at the tip of the leaf and just look at it straight on in front of you, it looks like a boat, looks like a canoe coming right at you. So that's pretty characteristic. And the leaves tend to be the same width. Parallel sides of the leaf, that's what that means. It's the same width through the length of the leaf. So that's going to help you identify Kentucky bluegrass. Now tall fescue, another very commonly used species in the state and very often mixed with Kentucky bluegrass. The way to identify that one, the color is not unlike Kentucky bluegrass, so you can't just go by that. Leaves are rolled in the bud. It has short rounded auricles and a short membranous ligule and rough edges. Now, that's the one I'm going to probably focus on with you because you can pick up this leaf, just run your fingertips along the edge, and you will immediately know that you're dealing with tall fescue because it feels just a tiny bit rough. And if you were to look at it with a microscope, you'd see that it's serrated. So it literally looks like tiny saw blades, okay? But as far as the other characteristics go, so here's the leaf, and I said it was rolled in the bud, and that's what it looks like, so it's rolled. Kentucky bluegrass, I said, was folded in the bud, so it would be more, it would be folded as opposed to circular like this. But let's talk about those other characteristics. So it's got short, rounded auricles. So you see that? That'd be some other characteristic you could look at. And it's also got a membranous ligule around the back of that stem there. Tall fescue is a tillering or bunch type grass. So it's not going to have below ground rhizomes or stolons. It's going to spread by putting on tillers in this way. Okay. What about perennial ryegrass? Again, very commonly mixed with Kentucky bluegrass and tall fescue. It has a very fine texture, a rich, quote unquote, color, rich green color, and the leaves are folded in the bud. And this is something I'd encourage you to focus on here. With perennial ryegrass, the backs of the leaves are really shiny. So again, you just take a look at that leaf, look at the front, look at the back. If the back is shiny, it is very likely that you've got perennial ryegrass. It's got clasping, auricles, and tapered leaves. So what do I mean by that? Here is an example of what the stem would look like if you were to cut it. It's folded in the bud, just like Kentucky bluegrass, but it's got, in this case, perennial ryegrass has these clasping auricles, like you see here, and those are the things you should focus on. Again, with the shiny leaf back, I would say is your really diagnostic characteristic there. Okay, so those are the really commonly seen species, and if you can at least be able to identify those, it's going to be your first step on the way to diagnosing other problems. So I'm going to walk you through the series of questions and the order of questions that I typically go through with folks to identify problems. First of all, I start out with fertilizing and ask them if they fertilized in the past 6 months. If they have, I move on. If they haven't, then we start talking about the possibility of nutrient deficiencies. And the problem with identifying turf issues, as well as other landscape issues, is that so many of them can resemble other ones, right? And so that's where all of these questions come into play, helping you to really identify what the problem is. Now, if they have fertilized, then I say, okay, so you've fertilized in the past 6 months. Have you fertilized more recently, within the past 2 weeks? If the answer is yes, then we start exploring the possibility of potential fertilizer burn, right? Because folks tend to think that if more is good, even more is better, which is certainly not the case. So we talk about that possibility. If they haven't, then we move on. Backing up just a bit, though, if we do determine that it's a nutrient deficiency issue, then I go through the process with them of talking about appropriate levels of fertilization for turf. I talk about soil testing, and have you had that conversation already this morning? You haven't? Okay. Well, one great resource that's available to you up at USU is the Utah State University Analytical Lab, usual.usu.edu. And that's a place where you can encourage folks to send soil samples. You can also send soil samples yourselves, and you can have nutrients analyzed in those samples. So that's a great resource that's available to you. So I'll start with that and then talk about the importance of nitrogen, which is going to be the most important nutrient for turf fertilization. I talk with them about the appropriate use of quick and slow release fertilizers, and then a fertilization schedule. Now, for most folks that are coming in with lawn concerns, I talk about this schedule, which is a medium level of maintenance with a fertilization in spring, late summer, and then late fall for a total of 3 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. This is a very commonly recommended schedule for turf. Understanding that this assumes they are returning the grass clippings. And that's really important because grass clippings actually contain quite a bit of nitrogen. And so that increases this number by up to 1 or 2 pounds. Okay? So that would be a total of 4 or 5 pounds of nitrogen over the course of the entire growing season. So I talk with them about that. Now, if it's something like this, if we're considering potential fertilizer burn, the tricky part about all of this is oftentimes they're explaining this to you, right? You're not looking at it. They're just telling you, well, it looks like this and it looks like that, and you're trying to envision in your mind, well, what the heck are they talking about? That's half the battle right there. But this is, for example, a place where a good bit, and I will confess this is my yard, I was refilling the spreader, and I don't know what happened, but needless to say, I didn't get it in the hopper, and a bunch of it fell on the lawn, and that was it. I mean, it was enough to the point that there was nothing I could do. I mean, I was rinsing, I was picking it up, I was doing everything I could, and it was just not happening. So it might look something like this, and maybe they've got a picture. I'm to the point now, and people are to the point now, everybody's got a smartphone, right? I tell them, take a picture, text it to me, email it to me. You know, let's look, tell me what you've got on your phone. So in that way, things are actually getting quite a bit easier. I think that's a really positive thing for us. Might look something like this. This is an area where there was some fertilizer burn. Okay. Now, moving past fertilizers, some of the next questions I get into are asking them if they have applied any kind of herbicide or pesticide within the past 2 weeks. Okay? If it's yes, then we start exploring that. You know, what was it? What were the rates that you used? Hopefully they know that. If not, we move on. But herbicide damage could look something like this. Again, this is a place where a little too much happened. This is actually, and I know the light's not great in here, but if you can notice right here, what happened was there was herbicide applied, but it ran over to one side and so caused this damage along the building. So, you know, these are kind of nondescript symptoms. And so it's where you really have to start asking them, what have you been applying and how much, and those sorts of questions. This is another situation where they put herbicide down but didn't follow label directions, and it was just a bit too much. Okay, so, but again, they might come to you and say, something is wrong with my sprinklers, right? Because that's the other thing that I notice. They always know what's wrong, but they're still asking you what's wrong. So again, you know, these things can really be hard to distinguish one from another, and that's where all your questioning comes in. Okay, moving on from herbicides and pesticides, I talk a lot with folks because, again, the other part of my job is landscape water conservation, but we talk about their irrigation systems, particularly in the growing season. I mean, obviously right now that's not a big issue, but during the growing season, irrigation systems are oftentimes the culprit, and so we have a conversation about the irrigation system, whether they've been operating it or checked on it in the past month. Is it working properly and giving full coverage? Now, this is a challenge to begin with because in my experience, most folks don't ever see the sprinkler system in operation, right? It's something that happens at night and they think it should be just fine, and so they don't really know. So I encourage them as a first step to even turn the thing on during the light of day and just see what's happening, because there can be very, very obvious problems. Broken heads, clogged heads, misaligned heads, tilted heads, sunken heads, simple things that can be fixed if only they see the thing in operation. So if they tell me, yes, I've turned it on, everything's good, it's working, we move on. If it's not working, then I try to help them address some of those problems. If they have no idea, I talk to them about performing a simple irrigation audit, which can involve putting out soup cans or other containers and just running the system and seeing how evenly that water is applied. So we talk about that process. Now, how many of you are along the Wasatch Front? Most of you? Yeah? Well, the good news about that is that there is a free program you can recommend to your clientele called, it's a water check program. It's run through Slow the Flow, and it's free. And so they can call 1-800, is it 1-800-SLOW-THE-FLOW? 1-800-SAVE-WATER. In any case, if you go to slowtheflow.org, you can have them sign up for that, and it's free. So I'd encourage you to do that. Now again, we move back up to where the irrigation is not working. You might see symptoms like this, okay? So problems that result when there's a broken head, and when there's one broken head, it's a problem because coverage is not equal. It's not even over the area. You might also see as a symptom puddling because there's a broken head or something broken underground, and that can encourage weed invasion. So that might be the symptom that you see. Might look something like this. This is a shadow, by the way. But it might look something like this where there's a broken head and lack of coverage, again, because in case you didn't know, with irrigation systems, they are designed, or they should be designed, so that the water from one sprinkler head reaches all the way to the adjacent sprinkler head and vice versa. That's how they're meant to work. So it's not like the spray from one gets halfway there. That's not how they're meant to work. They're meant to have head-to-head coverage. And so again, when one sprinkler head is broken, you start to see problems like this, and you can see some actually very interesting patterns in the area. Poor distribution uniformity, so there's a lack of even application of water in this area. Now, that can be because the system wasn't designed correctly and there's not head-to-head coverage, but it might also be, and is oftentimes the result of, inadequate pressure in the irrigation system, because sprinklers are designed to operate at specified pressures. And so that's something that you can explore with them. This is another symptom of a pressure problem. So these are typical fixed spray heads, and the pressure is too much, and so the water that's moving through those heads is being broken into lots of teeny tiny droplets, and they blow very easily with the wind. So that can be another indication of a pressure problem. Misaligned heads, that's one of the easiest things to diagnose, right? I mean, this is pretty extreme, and this is a large rotor head, but it's spraying across 5 lanes of traffic. Okay, that's not where it's meant to be, although these folks, they're getting a free car wash, but I suspect they weren't intending that, okay? So misaligned heads, easy to identify, fairly easy to fix. This, and by the way, that free auditing program that we run along the Wasatch Front, we've been doing it for 12 years now, I want to say. We've literally done more than 10,000 residential irrigation audits. These kinds of problems, these are what we see most commonly, and they are the most common cause of lack of efficient application of water. So over time, and it's totally normal, irrigation systems aren't meant to be installed and then completely forgotten about. They require maintenance, just like everything else. So heads tend to sink over time. Maybe they get run over with a mower. There can be a number of different reasons that this happens, but it happens over time, and it just requires, again, operating the system in the light of day, identifying those problems, and then fixing them. What's the problem with this? Do you know? Right, exactly. So this is a situation in which overhead spray and rotors are on the same zone. Okay, why is that a problem? Exactly, exactly. So they're covering different areas, and they're also putting out different amounts of water over the same time period. There is no way to do this efficiently. Right? You're either going to favor the area with the rotors, in which case this place is going to get very dry, or you're going to favor the areas with the spray heads, and you're going to perhaps create a ponding or puddling situation. Okay? So that's a big design problem. Sometimes folks can make better use of alternative irrigation systems. So they might be, and this is particularly true with ornamental areas, but they may be better off trying to use drip type or alternative type irrigation systems in an area like this than trying to efficiently irrigate this tiny area with fixed spray heads. So you can have that conversation with them. Now this is an irrigation schedule that it's a general schedule for the Wasatch Front area, and it's a basic one that you can start with, and it assumes that each irrigation would be applying ½ inch of water every time. And initially, you'd start irrigating that ½ inch every 6 days, and then as the growing season progressed, you would decrease that interval in between irrigations, and then increase it again at the end of the season. Now, this is based on a 30-year average, so 30 years of weather data, and because it's based on an average, what that means is that in an extremely wet year, this would over-irrigate, and in an extremely dry year, it would under-irrigate, okay? But it's a really good point to start from, because we can't predict in any given growing season what's going to happen, right? We just have to start at our best point and move forward from there. So then this can be adjusted from that point. Okay, so I already mentioned something about this, but doing a simple audit. These particular catch cups, has anybody seen these out there? A few of you? These are available at the county extension offices, and I actually have a licensing agreement with the Bureau of Reclamation to sell these if it's something you're interested in too. But you can borrow them from the county extension offices, and They will often loan them to homeowners as well, but to do a simple irrigation audit, and we talked about this already, but this is one technique. You can also use a soup can, something like that, a cut-off milk carton, something like that. I try to steer folks away from tuna cans because the water can splash out, okay? But they certainly don't need to use something like this, but it is available. So there's some simple procedures so that they could do an irrigation audit. All right. So we've talked about pesticides, we've talked about fertilization, irrigation systems. Then I start talking with folks about mowing. And if they're mowing properly, to them the turf appears uniform and even, they're okay with that. So we move on. If it seems like they're having scalping or discoloration, we explore those possibilities. So, you know, it's not uncommon. Over time, roots can sometimes create lumps and bumps in a lawn, and so then you go over it with the mower and you scalp it. So that can happen. That's what's happened here. This is another mowing problem. What's the problem here? Dull blade, right? So if their mower blade isn't reasonably sharp, you know, they haven't sharpened it in about 20 years probably, then you start getting this kind of symptom. And over time, they start to dry out from the tips back, and over time the discoloration just increases and increases and increases, and they're not sure what's going on, but this is pretty easy to diagnose. This is an illustration of mower scalp. Again, not uncommon. Could be because they ran over a bump. Could be because perhaps their mower needs some additional maintenance. They've got a mower blade that's tilted, something like that. Okay, mowing height. Now this is something I talk about a lot with folks because in my experience, my observation, I notice that people tend to mow shorter than they need to, shorter than they should. And there's a relationship between mowing height and rooting depth in turf. That is, that the higher you mow the grass, the deeper the roots will grow. And that's a really positive thing, having deeper roots, for a number of reasons. First, it helps that turf to be able to absorb water from deeper in the soil profile. So from a water conservation standpoint, that's a good thing. But having those roots deep also gives that turf a little bit more stress tolerance, whether it's drought, insects, pests, whatever. It just helps it. It helps it to have that greater rooting depth. So these are, again, the common species that are used. You can encourage folks to get as close as they can to the 3-inch mark, but they're going to be limited by their mower, okay? Mowers are adjustable usually, but they may only go so far. But I encourage folks to get up here 2, 2.5, 3 inches in height. That's a good height to be to encourage that deeper rooting. With clippings, and this is another thing, so some folks may come to you with the misunderstanding that clippings produce thatch. Have you heard that? Anybody? Yeah? Okay. That's one of those urban myths I'm trying to debunk. And basically the idea in the past was that when you return clippings, they created thatch in the lawn. But in fact, grass clippings, they're composed mainly of water. They decompose very quickly, and they have a lot of nutrients in them. So if you can leave them on the lawn, they'll decompose pretty quickly, and they'll provide a nutrient source to the grass, like I talked about earlier, 1 to 2 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. Now, there are situations where doing this is not appropriate. If, for example, they haven't mowed it in 2-3 weeks, that's not the time to come in and cut it all down and leave the clippings. They should be removed at that point and then start again, okay? Because doing it at that point, you'd have a lot of smothering of the grass underneath. That's just too much growth. Other situations where it might interfere with the turf use, that's another time when, again, you might want to remove the clippings. And here I'm really thinking more of sports applications, park applications where kids might be playing. You don't want anybody slipping or tripping or anything like that. People do not need to use mulching mowers. A mower with a reasonably sharp blade is just fine. Mulching mower is fine too, but it's not an absolute necessity for returning grass clippings. Okay, now, another topic that I explore with folks is compaction and thatch, because both of these are, and I treat them together because they're treated in the same way essentially. So we talk about the area. Does it get a whole lot of traffic? Does it seem like it's compacted? Those are questions I ask. What does the thatch look like? Is there thatch? Is it too much? Because thatch in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly normal for grass to have a certain amount of thatch, you know, maybe 1/2 inch or less. But once you get beyond that, 1 inch or more of thatch, then it becomes it becomes an issue as far as how you manage the grass. So they may say no, but they may say, yeah, I think I might have a compaction problem, maybe thatch. So, you know, this is what we typically see on campus with compaction. A lot of foot traffic, and it's actually not the impact of feet on grass here that's killing this grass. It's what's happening to the soil beneath it. So the soil is getting compacted to the point that it can't absorb water. And if it can't absorb any water, then the grass can't take any water up. So that's what's actually happening there. So you might see that. Here's an illustration of thatch. So in case you can't see it all that well, here is the native soil in this area, the growing grass here, and all this in between is thatch. And it's actually composed of stems and roots for the most part, both living and dead. And if, again, ½ an inch or less, no problem. But once you start getting beyond that, what happens is the growing grass starts rooting into this thatch layer. And this thatch layer is really light, it's really fluffy, it doesn't hold any moisture whatsoever. And so the grass starts drying out very quickly, and people are kind of hurrying up with their irrigation to try to catch up. So that's why you don't want to have too much thatch. And that's what it might look like. Now, dealing with both of these problems, backing up again to basic cultural practices like proper fertilization and irrigation is a way to avoid both. Thatch buildup, and it can help as far as the competitiveness and health of grass, even in an area that's receiving a lot of foot traffic. But a typical approach and solution will be simple aerification. Most times that's sufficient. So simple core aerification where they're pulling those plugs and dealing with it that way. Maybe they're renting a piece of equipment from you, I don't know. But that is one way to deal with compaction as well as thatch. Now there are a few situations, and I haven't seen too many in the state, but there are a few where the thatch is built up to a point where you have to be a little bit more aggressive, and you might do a vertical mowing or a dethatching program. Okay, but this is the point where they always tell me, you know what, I've been doing everything perfectly. You know, clearly it's not a management thing, because I go through all that first. It's not that. It's something real. It's a real insect. It's a real disease. Okay, so then I'm like, all right, again, what exactly is it that you're seeing out there? If they start out with, well, there's spots out there, there's patches of thin, brown, dying grass, and I'm absolutely certain it's some kind of an insect or disease. In terms of insects, these are the very commonly seen insect pests in the state on turf. So first and foremost, white grubs, #1 by far and away. Next, cutworms and armyworms. We also have some sod webworms, and we deal with billbug damage in the state as well. And all of these have symptoms like this, irregular spots or patches of brown, thin, or dying grass. White grubs, I'm going to focus on these highlighted points here because those are the real diagnostic characteristics that you can ask folks about. But when the problem is really severe, the turf can actually be lifted away. You could almost roll it back like a carpet. So if that's what they're seeing, you might have your first indication that they've truly got some grubs. Now, maybe they're actually bringing this to you. Hopefully you can all identify that, right? Those are grubs, and they are white, they are C-shaped, they've got 3 pairs of legs in the front, they've got a brown head. They vary in size depending on the beetle that they are the larvae for, but that's what they look like. Sometimes the first indication may be secondary damage from small mammals or birds. They might be seeing some invasion by weeds. The challenge with grubs is that they are an issue all season long. They go through multiple life cycles, and so treating them becomes a multi-stage process. It's not something that can be done once and then left alone. Now, cutworms and armyworms, again, similar damage to the grubs, but you might see circular spots of dead grass, or they might look like they've just been sunken down, so these little depressed spots. You could come across the larvae, the caterpillars, and I know Ryan was here earlier. He's the person up on campus that helps us identify all these things. So again, a great resource that's available to you. Sod webworm, the damage, again, small irregular brown patches, closely cropped grass. And the other thing I talk about with folks is I ask them, do you walk across the turf and do you see a moth flying up ahead of you, right? Are you disturbing a moth that's out there? They'll fly up, they'll do a little zigzag pattern, and then they land back down on the turf. That can be an indication that there's some sod webworm out there. They're not hard to catch, by the way, these moths, and if you do, or if one is brought to you, they have a snout on the front that sticks out like that, and that can be your first identifying characteristic that it's sod webworm. Now with billbug, again, very, very commonly seen in the state, what happens is the grass plant breaks easily at the crown. So if you were to grasp the grass plant near the soil surface and just give it a little tug, it just gives way, like nothing's holding it there at all. Okay, now on the disease side, same symptoms. So I'm still talking about irregular spots or patches of brown, thin, or dying grass. On the disease side, these are the most common culprits. So we've got anthracnose is one, snow molds, rhizoctonia, and take-all patch. So to try to identify one or the other from these, with anthracnose, if you look carefully at the leaves, you're going to see these black fruiting structures on the leaves. Okay? So that's really very diagnostic of anthracnose. That'd be the first thing that I would be looking for. Again, same in terms of irregular patches. The patches tend to be on the smaller side, so 2 to 12 inches in diameter. And again, you want to focus on these black fruiting structures. Now the snow molds, I suspect you're all very familiar with these. Yeah? Has everyone seen something like this? Most of you? Okay. Well, one of the things that I like to mention to folks is that you don't have to have snow cover to have snow mold. So that's a misconception that's out there. So someone may come to you and they'll say, no, it's not snow mold. It can't be because I didn't have snow cover there. Well, that's not a real indication. Okay, so talk with them about what they're seeing. They may see this pink sort of margin for some snow molds, but they may not. Okay, so damage typically is occurring in the early spring, right? When snow's melting off or things are warming up, that's when the damage is pretty typically seen. Rhizoctonia, again, you're going to have these patches, but they tend to be a bit larger, so larger than what I just showed you. They can be several feet across. And what you'll find there in terms of a diagnostic characteristic is if you start digging around near the base of the plant, start looking at the roots, start looking at the crown of the plant, so exactly where it meets the soil, you're going to see these round, blackish brown bodies, and those are sclerotia, and they can indicate rhizoctonia. Take-all patch, again, it's a patch disease. It can expand to 3 feet or more, but the edges of the patches may be reddish brown or bronze, so that can be a diagnostic characteristic there. And the growth for this is going to tend to be pretty slow. All right. So those are the insects and diseases that are commonly associated with irregular spots or patches of brown, thin, or dying grass. But, maybe they've got some other symptoms. For example, rings or patches of dead grass or dark green bands of turf. So I get those kinds of symptoms quite a bit. I get asked about those kinds quite a bit. In terms of diseases, the commonly associated diseases with those symptoms include fairy ring, so that's what you see here, and necrotic ring spot. This is by far and away the disease I get asked about the most every year, necrotic ring spot. So let's talk a little bit about those. So, before I do that, summer patch is another disease that may be the cause of rings or patches of dead grass. And then this past year, on the insect side, something that we saw become very active that hadn't been too active in the past was chinch bugs. And I remember when I first got to Utah, and this was a while ago, I was told we never get chinch bugs in the diagnostic lab. It's just not an issue here in the state of Utah. Well, guess what? It has become an issue in the state of Utah. And so it's something definitely for you guys to be aware of this coming growing season because it was a big issue last year. Okay, so more information on each of these. With fairy ring, you tend to see a very distinct outer ring. It may have mushrooms like this, but more often what I've seen here is that it does not. And so it tends to be just a dark green color. So you might see something like that. If you dig down, you may see these white mycelium. And fairy ring is caused by a basidiomycete. So it's a mushroom fungus, basically. So that's why you sometimes see mushrooms. And these are part of their growth structure, mycelium, so you might see that as well. With necrotic ring spot, dead circles, these can be various sizes. I've heard this called frog eye before, simply because it's got green in the center. It can be really hard to control, even with fungicides, and so it's one where I really emphasize resistant turf varieties when folks have this problem persistently. And fortunately, there are a number of resistant turf varieties that I can talk about with them. Summer patch, you tend to have small circular patches of wilted or thin turf. Sometimes they're crescent-shaped, sometimes they're ring-shaped. So that can make it really difficult to tell the difference between this summer patch and necrotic ring spot. And in fact, the treatment is very much the same. And so we've just finished revising and rewriting an extension fact sheet on necrotic ring spot and summer patch together because they're so similar. So that's going to be published very shortly, and it talks about the resistant varieties as well as treatment options. Okay, now chinch bugs, patchy dieback, it tends to turn yellow and then brown. People oftentimes think it's a water issue. It's particularly problematic in hot, dry weather, which is why last summer we really saw a lot of activity with chinch bug. And people sometimes aren't sure. You know, they think, well, something's going on with the irrigation, and then by the time they do figure out they've got an actual insect problem, they can be looking at complete loss depending on the situation. All right, so what about leaf coating or spotting? These are fairly simple to diagnose relative to some of the others, but powdery mildew, I'm sure you're all very familiar with that. Rust, this is one that I got a lot of questions about this year that I hadn't had before. Again, another pest that's becoming more active as far as I can tell in the state. So easy to identify in that it looks like the leaves are rust colored. And then fading out is another one where you can have coatings on the leaves. Now powdery mildew, again, I'm sure you're all familiar, not just on turf, but on other plants as well. So you've got this white powdery coating on the leaves. And with turf, it's especially prevalent in shady areas. It can spread. You know, the nice thing, I guess, if I had to say there was a nice thing about one of these diseases is that once things warm up and dry out, you know, this is more of a problem in the spring or in very shady areas. But if things can dry out and warm up, it tends to go away pretty easily. Again, with rust, you've got leaves covered with rust-colored growth. Typically occurs during periods of slow growth, so it also may occur if irrigation is heavy at night. So that's something that I talk about with folks in terms of their irrigation schedule and how they time it. Fading out. Now here's the characteristic, again, we're talking about leaf spot type diseases here, but with fading out, if you look at the leaves, they'll have a circular purplish or dark brown ring on the leaf, and in the middle of that ring it'll be sort of straw colored. That's really diagnostic of this particular disease. Now finally, you might see, or your client might see, piles of soil, or maybe they're going to see some debris on the surface of the turf. So I get, depending on the year, again, I get questions about this. So there's a lot of earthworm activity, and people don't like to see those lumps and bumps of soil, although I will typically congratulate them if they're seeing that, because it means they've actually got a very, very healthy soil plant system. If earthworms are choosing to live there and be active there, that's actually a really great thing. They're like natural aerators, and they're doing a lot to improve the quality of the situation. So maybe something like this, maybe something like this, which to me strikes fear into my heart. I had severe vole damage on research plots early on in my career here at USU, and it was devastating. I mean, devastating. What I've noticed over time is that voles tend to be more active when they've got a good amount of snow cover. So brace yourselves for this spring. I think we could see a lot of folks coming in with vole damage. Right, with earthworms, again, they're not actually pests of turf, and it kind of hurts my heart when I hear people call in and say, what can I use to kill these things? They are not pests, and so I think they are to be cherished and helped along and not decimated. They're primarily beneficial. The castings are rich in nutrients, but again, this is the issue. So if it's a problem for folks, I talk about rolling the lawn with them. Okay, using some kind of weighted roller, you can smooth out a lot of those lumps and bumps, and hopefully that'll be sufficient. With voles, what they do is under snow cover typically, They get into the thatch layer, so again, a good reason to keep thatch under control. But they get into the thatch layer and they create these tunnels, and it just takes a really, really long time for these things to fill in and recover. A really, really long time. So it's definitely problematic. I just made a note here that they're excellent swimmers because I've had a lot of people say to me, I'm just going to stick a hose down that hole and I'm going to drown them. Well, they can swim and they're not going to be hurt by that. All right, so kind of to wrap up, knowing something about how the area was managed, the history of the property, being able to identify the species, collecting plant samples and doing a couple other things can be helpful in trying to diagnose some of these problems. Just some information about sampling for diagnosis. Did you guys go over this at all with Ryan? Maybe a little, no? Okay. With turf, you want to make sure you're collecting all the plant parts. So not just some leaves. You need to have some roots and some soil associated as well. And if your sample can capture both a healthy area and a diseased area, that's helpful as well. That's usually where there's the most activity going on. You can use a hand lens to look closely. I talked about some sclerotia and some other structures that they can be a little hard to see, so a hand lens can be helpful. Several areas should be sampled, and again, I mentioned sampling the edges is important. And then I'll talk at the end about where you might send something like that. Now, another really easy technique I call the soak test, and that just involves, and you could share this with someone, this just involves mixing 1 or 2 ounces of dish soap, lemony dish soap, Joy seems to work well for this, with a couple gallons of warm water, and then pouring it over a square yard. So that's 1 square yard, just pouring it over evenly and letting it go for about an hour. What happens is that soapy water moves through the soil, and the soap actually irritates insects that are there and causes them to come up. So then you can get them, right? Capture them and see exactly what you're dealing with. Be sure, though, if you recommend this to folks, that they rinse this off with fresh water afterwards, because you don't want the leaves to be scalded by having that soap on them. Okay, so a bit about sampling, a bit about soap soak. You can get information on how to do the sampling and where to send it at this website. And this stuns me, $7. $7 for folks to get a problem identified. I think that's a bargain. That's a real bargain to get some really terrific information and a positive identification, right? Because I think, or I hope, you get a sense from the presentation here today that a lot of problems look very similar to other problems. And so unless you have a positive identification of the disease or the insect or the cultural issue, then you're kind of shooting in the dark. You don't know if you're doing the right thing. You don't know if the approach you're taking is going to actually solve the problem. So hopefully what I've talked about today is going to help at least get you in the ballpark and maybe positively identify what the problem is. But again, sending a sample here can be helpful. There are useful pieces of information available on this website, including all kinds of fact sheets and pest advisories, which I'm going to talk about related to turf here in a second. So those are resources available to you, and of course the county extension faculty, as well as campus extension faculty. We are also resources that are available to you. Now, as far as the turf stuff goes, I put out a quarterly IPM advisory on the turf problems that we're seeing across the state. And I try to make this real time. So when people submit samples and they're identified by Ryan and or Claudia, who's our plant pathologist, we put out this advisory and I make note of what county we're seeing it in. I talk about possible treatment methods and things like that. So this comes out quarterly, spring, summer, winter, fall. It's got the most up-to-date information, and it goes out by email. So if that's something that you're interested in, there's this web address where you can sign up. You can also go to the Utah Pests website and sign up there for not only this advisory, but advisories on other landscape plant materials and a lot of other plants as well. Okay, so that's another great resource that's available to you, and it just comes to you by email. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up there. I would be happy to answer a few questions if you have them, and I'll be hanging around to pack up in case you want to talk with me on the side.